Welcome to this, the last event in the UNDP's Dialogue Series, Development Dialogue Series. I'm your moderator, Mark Edo, and over the last 4 months, we've been joined by many thinkers or rethinkers in the Development Dialogue Series who've offered fresh perspectives and fresh solutions related to crisis in the decade of action. All through, we've asked the question, how can we approach development differently to deliver solutions that are transformative, ambitious, relevant, principled, and at scale? How do we best help build the foundations of stable societies and enable choice and opportunity for people, communities, governments, and societies? The discussions have focused around a broad range of subjects such as conflict prevention, COVID-19 responses, green energy, green financing, climate, and women's leadership. From Cambodia to Bangladesh to Ethiopia to Yemen, we've shared stories and studies that illustrate how UNDP's partnerships are having a transformative impact, particularly for nations staring down the spectre of the worst global pandemic in 100 years, while dealing with the harsh realities of conflict or of crisis. We're at an inflection point where we have to define the future of development. What was abundantly clear is that UNDP has a huge and increasingly more important role to play in helping to build a more equitable world that's focused on people, planet, and prosperity. We have great challenges ahead, but also great opportunities to try new pathways and take new, bold approaches together. In this closing event, we will hear from influential and important partners on the expectations for UNDP's role in developing solutions to crisis and seek their views on the way forward with an eye on 2030. There are 2 panel discussions today with an excellent lineup of speakers that includes the chair of the G7+, as well as the chief executive of Oxfam. And there'll be plenty of time for your questions to be answered. So please start typing them into the Q&A box right now or via the comment section if you're watching on our YouTube channel. In a few minutes, we'll be joined by UNDP's administrator, Achim Steiner, who's standing by. But first, here's a video that reminds us how fruitful the development dialogues have been over the past 4 months. Could you please roll that video?
How do we build livelihood systems that help people move beyond recovery towards prosperity?
What do we need to do differently to deliver development solutions to the most left behind?
Are you hopeful that progress can be accelerated as we near 2030?
What does conflict look like in a decade from now?
How can we create an enabling environment for the key building blocks for risk-informed development?
What progress have we made towards getting out of the silos already? What can we see that's working? What can we see that's encouraging?
How can we do more with what we have? How can we be more creative in thinking through applications? How do we get these technologies in the hands of communities and of decision makers so that this actually hits the road and impacts the way that we're working, impacts the results?
Building resilience in today's world needs to consider 3 things. First, the interconnectedness of systems. Second, the multidimensionality of risks beyond disaster and climate risks. And third, the underlying drivers of risks linked to poverty, inequalities, and weak governance.
Addressing the existing wars and conflicts and preventing the same is a common public good for us. We need to quadruple our efforts and deploy all arms of diplomacy to foster peace and stability everywhere in the world.
We can see today that stellar performance of female leaders have been receiving global attention. this can be a change, a deep change in perceptions about women's leadership. And this will include, of course, crisis countries. I truly believe that this can be a momentum where we can push hard to replace this old and obsolete masculine leadership archetype.
After a year of intermittent lockdowns across the world, one thing is very clear. Human mobility is not principally a problem to be solved. It is a value to be treasured and to be realized.
The systems that made us successful in the past will not be the same systems that will make us thrive in the 21st century. Therefore, being agile, adaptive, and future-facing are critical not only for fragile environments, but because we need to better recover from the pandemic and prepare for much bigger crises to come.
Today's discussion extends beyond the COVID response. It is really about a broader shift in the way of thinking and acting, so that urgent does not mean humanitarian response, and fragility does not only mean crisis response.
Transitional justice is not just about dwelling on the past. It is fundamentally forward-looking. We look back at past events to address the conditions that destabilized and made our societies vulnerable to human rights violations, abuses, and crimes, so as to enable the building of more inclusive and peaceful societies.
I refuse to believe that the needle can't be pushed forward. I contend that progress in mine action can be attained, measured, and sustained if and only if the political will is there.
COVID-19 has amplified inequalities. It's one of the biggest challenges of our time. And at the same time, this crisis is a real opportunity for building a better future and to ensure together as one world community a better, greener, and more equitable world.
Our experience is that basic preventive efforts can have important effects against radicalization in general, regardless of ideology.
We are convinced that UNDP's work must help trigger a seismic shift in the power imbalances that drives gender inequality. We need to move from inclusion to transformation.
It's very clear that progress towards 2030 can be subject to multiple types of shocks and risks. And so this is a really opportune time to have this discussion.
We do need to improve how we are using the 2030 agenda entry point, because many times we see that the incentives really to act early and collaboratively are not always there.
When we look into the future within the next decade, when we look at the threat vectors from a number of the dynamics that are currently going and looking at where they're heading, I think governance becomes a really prominent component that we cannot avoid.
All projections indicate that cities will define the development trajectory over coming decades and beyond.
To achieve progress on the SDGs, disability inclusion cannot be approached as a standalone issue, but rather needs to be promoted across all policies and programs.
Traditional and classical approaches alone can neither tackle drivers of fragility and bring stability and peace, nor achieve the central promise of the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind. There is a need to have innovative, transformative mechanism, policy, and strategy to tackle these critical challenges.
Yes, indeed. As we said, this event is the culmination of 4 months of development dialogue discussions. And what we want to do is use this opportunity today to take stock of what we've learned, what solutions and action points we've uncovered so that we can take all that and use it to inform UNDP's upcoming new framework for development solutions in crisis and fragile context. This is a sort of ultimate guide that sets out, or sets forward, should I say, what UNDP will do to ensure a systematic solutions that are tailored to individual crisis contexts. It'll help us determine how we're going to change the way we work, and how we're going to strengthen our partnerships, and how we ensure that we are well equipped to deliver the best results we can. You could say UNDP's mandate to deal with the root causes of underdevelopment is unique in the UN system, from fixing the social contract to helping prepare and mitigate the impact of climate change. No other agency has the same breadth of mandate and, should I dare say, the same responsibility. Through its work in the areas of conflict prevention, recovery, stabilization, and transition to development, UNDP supports all 57 countries identified in the OECD States of Fragility report. In fact, UNDP spends over half of its budget each year in fragile contexts, and that's where almost all of its biggest offices are located. Well, our first speaker is a person who I always enjoy listening to because I always learn something very valuable from him. I'm very pleased to be joined by the UNDP Administrator, Achim Steiner, for his introductory remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark. And with such a nice introduction, I feel very empowered to offer a few reflections. But let me first of all thank you for moderating us through this final session of our Development Dialogue series. And let me thank all those thousands of friends, colleagues, partners, and perhaps those who for the first time encountered UNDP and each other through this platform for a very intense period of learning. We can learn a lot from within an organization, from what we do through evaluations, lessons learned, but I always find that the greatest way of learning is to learn from one another and to listen to one another. So this afternoon, I also thank this very distinguished group of panelists for finding a moment to join us in putting a temporary wrapper, if you want, around this series of dialogues. And as you alluded to it already, we are in the midst of a deep reflection period, because much of what we observe in addressing crisis, be it from the perspective of prevention or from recovery and building resilience, really carries within it some examples of great success, many examples of mixed outcomes, and some tragic failures also. And I think in the midst of this pandemic, we are reminded that crises never really are predictable. They come sometimes unexpectedly. They come not as we perhaps theorized they would unfold. And how we can also return to a development pathway, if you want, beyond crisis, sometimes takes very circuitous pathways. And I think the first perhaps aspect that I would like to highlight, and that I hope in the panels also this afternoon we can explore a little bit more, is what is it that has changed in terms of the crisis and the conflict settings we face today? I mean, just a few remarks here, or a few words can perhaps highlight the protracted nature of crises and conflicts, the degree to which people now are often displaced or become refugees, literally in an intergenerational sense, but not by being able to move to somewhere else and build up a new life, but being trapped in either camps for internally displaced people for years, or in refugee camps in another country, confined to those refugee camps, sometimes for 10, 15, 20 years. These are unimaginable realities that have unfolded. The nature of conflict is also far more protracted, in the sense that we don't seem to have, as in the past, moments where conflict openly begins and then is settled. It is as the word says, protracted nature that has maintained our inability to also operate very often in very confused contexts. Very often we are confronted with the challenge of how do you intervene, how do you contribute to helping a country emerge from conflict, if in essence the political dimensions of that situation force us to reduce the international engagement essentially to a humanitarian intervention, which is central and critical to saving lives, but very often cannot really trigger the very forces that would actually allow us to emerge from conflict and to rebuild. And much has been said and written and also framed in terms of this humanitarian peace and development nexus, HDP. And I think we are also at a point in time where not only in UNDP, but with our colleagues in the OECD, and I thank Susanna also for joining us today, there's a great deal of introspection about what it is that we need to change. And certainly leading the United Nations Development Programme, which by virtue of its presence on the ground and therefore being with its feet and its ability to operate on the ground in virtually every country that has or is going through a crisis or is facing conflict, we are an integral part of the United Nations promise to try and be of assistance, sometimes more at the end of the humanitarian response, as we see when open conflicts or natural disasters occur, but always with the DNA of trying to already rebuild from the response to a crisis to the emergency response by trying to bring a perspective on how do you help people to rebuild their livelihoods? How do you quickly rehabilitate infrastructure to enable people to return? And we learned a great deal in Iraq with the stabilization program, where thousands of projects were implemented in a matter of months as a rapid way of enabling people to return back to their homes that had been either destroyed or where infrastructure such as water provision, sewage, electricity had been destroyed by the conflict. But by quickly rehabilitating it, we made it possible for people to return and be part of the rebuilding effort and not to be stuck for years in camps where essentially they are rendered recipients of aid, but really not able to do anything about their own future. We operate in contexts such as Yemen today, where the protracted nature of this conflict has caused untold damage to the country, its people, its development prospects. We estimate that Yemen has lost well over 20 years of its development progress in these last few years of conflict. How do we assist a country where in many ways there are two authorities operating, where the capacity of the state to deliver development services is often reduced to virtually zero, and at the same time you don't only want an entire population to depend on handouts. Being able to address underlying issues such as the infrastructure, which determines the ability for food to actually reach the country, livelihoods programs, training people in new skills, introducing off-grid renewable energy sources as a way of providing electricity in an otherwise context of darkness after sunset. Does it make sense? Can we actually, with these measures, contribute to a rapid recovery and create the conditions for a peace dividend once conflict ceases to be the driving force? Mark, you referred briefly to the framework for development solutions for crisis and fragile contexts. It is our effort to be and to give expression to the fact that I see UNDP very much as a learning organization. We are not only learning for the sake of implementing UNDP's work, we are a platform. We are in some ways also a mirror through which the world can look at its collective efforts to address these issues and to help frame perhaps some reflections on where we really do need to transform our approaches, where we need new avenues of working and where we need new partnerships also. And UNDP certainly is exploring in many different contexts, not least in the Sahel right now, how we can fundamentally rethink our role as a development program of the United Nations, operating in the midst of an escalating crisis in security terms, livelihood terms, poverty, governance, and also the expansion of extremist forces in the region. Development is, at the end of the day, very often a reason in terms of its failure why conflicts and crises emerge. So that understanding of how early developmental interventions or recognizing development failures can be addressed in order to avoid conflicts around injustice or discrimination or extreme poverty or exclusion to explode is a key part of our value proposition that we believe we share with many others who work at the interface of that humanitarian development peace nexus. But secondly, also in the midst of conflict, being able to maintain an operational capacity, joining hands and forces with our humanitarian colleagues as they save lives at that very moment, we working alongside can accelerate also the conditions within which perhaps a recovery can take place more quickly. These are some of the things that are also guiding us now in the rethinking of our approach, not just in a region such as the Sahel, but in the context of our overall work. The new strategic plan of UNDP sets out to reflect some of these lessons learned without always having already an answer of how to do it better. But the first step to doing something better is to recognize that something may not be working or that it needs to evolve and to work with others to do so. So in that spirit, I offer again a very warm welcome to all the wonderful panelists who have joined us for this afternoon, and to all those who have joined us online, and the thousands who have made this development dialogue series such an interactive and fascinating 4 months of dialogue, learning, and hopefully drawing inspiration from the ideas that others have developed. Thank you very much, Mark, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Administrator. So many touch points, but we don't have a lot of time. So I only have a little bit of time to ask you 1 or 2 questions. My first question to you is that one of the things that was crystal clear from the dialogues was that there's an enormous development challenges. They exist in the crisis context. For me, what was fascinating to learn about was the tremendous work that UNDP is already doing to support those most left behind. Administrator, so this is the decade of action, as the UN is calling. So if you were to pick 3 actions that UNDP must take now to contribute to a better future for people, for societies, and for governments that are impacted by crisis, what would those 3 actions be?
Let me start perhaps with the most challenging. How do you strengthen the capacity of a country, in principle also through its government institutions, at a moment of crisis when usually government institutions are most constrained and affected? What can an international partner contribute to a government being able to reach remote parts of the country, contested areas of national territory, the borderlands, as we sometimes refer to them with our Borderlands Center that we have established in Nairobi, to also draw attention to the fact that it is in the remote regions where the greatest absence of development impacts and the development state presence is felt. How can we help countries address this at that moment? Because it is a matter of resources, capacity, priority setting, and having a very clear understanding of what would have the greatest impact on people affected by crisis or conflict. Secondly, how do we better understand that even within a crisis context, there is enormous scope for helping people to stabilize their livelihoods, to rapidly put measures in place that allow them to perhaps rebuild what they have lost, and thirdly, to also be able to operate outside the intense conflict zones. Our experience in Iraq, our experience right now in Libya, where, over the past year, we have worked in 70–80% of the governorates of the country, despite the intense conflict that was happening in the north of the country. Localization is another frontier that allows us to rebuild, if you want, not only the ability to act from the bottom up, but it also draws on often institutions that are closest to the people that are seeking support, municipalities, local government authorities, and UNDP has learned a lot in this context. And thirdly, perhaps not always necessarily in the top 3, but in some contexts it can be transformative. Understand also how technology can help us. We have been able to use digitalization in many different contexts to enable us to do things that otherwise would not have been possible, whether it is to identify those most affected, people in remote areas using satellite imagery and many other tools that allow us to essentially deploy technology where, in the absence of that use, we simply wouldn't know where to prioritize interventions, how to reach people, how to connect them. And related to that is a corollary, the deployment of off-grid renewable energy sources. In a region such as the Sahel, where so many people have no access to electricity, being able to introduce off-grid renewable energy technology, principally solar technology, as a way of bringing electricity and power into many of the remote areas could prove transformative, not in itself, but as a catalyst. And learning how to do that when much else is not really functioning in terms of a government service delivery structure is another frontier. So again, these are all examples. None of them are formulas, but this is part of what UNDP tries to bring to this challenge, which is not a singular formula, but the ability to draw from many experiences, many opportunities to act, and then the expertise of how you actually can be a partner in the midst of crisis and conflict.
Administrator, the dialogues were so rich. We learned a lot about the development losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was really fascinating to understand just how much it's impacted and how people have been impacted by this crisis as it continues. Now it seems likely that some countries like Somalia, or you mentioned Yemen in your opening remarks, won't be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And it's also clear that short-term patches can't solve serious problems. So what should UNDP's approach be in these protracted crises with these major risks to the Agenda 2030 in these countries?
Well, first of all, the targets and indicators and the inability to meet them because you might have had a major earthquake or a massive drought and famine, or indeed a conflict. These crises, these shocks, may make the timeline for achieving those targets and indicators unachievable, but I don't think they render the Sustainable Development Goals as a template, as a compass with which to actually design, invest, and accelerate resilience building, recovery, and development. So I always urge everyone who is tempted, also in the midst of this pandemic, when we're experiencing major setbacks, and as I mentioned, the conflict in Yemen has thrown the country back by more than 20 years, but also the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean, where we just released a regional human development report, concludes that already Latin America and the Caribbean are back to the year 2008 in terms of extreme poverty levels. That means 13 years of progress lost, short term at least. So it is against this backdrop that I think understanding where you can begin to invest in a community's capacity to recover, but always with a view that, you know, development is not different because it emerges from a crisis moment as opposed to from a more designed next step in development. So investing $1, €1, a yen, for argument's sake, in reduction of poverty needs to nowadays be designed in such a way that it can also address access to energy, that it can create jobs, that it contributes to a low-carbon economy re-emerging out of crisis, that gender issues are addressed, gender inequality. It is designing that $1 intervention that may be triggered by one particular priority in a smart, intelligent way that allows multiple benefits to emerge. That is one fundamental design principle that the SDGs represent. And the second one is an overarching one. The 2030 agenda is a universal agenda. It was deliberately adopted as a universal agenda because it spoke to our interdependence. And much of what we have to recognize in today's world is that as a global community, we may not be directly involved in a crisis or a conflict far from one part of the world that takes place in another. But at the end of the day, we are inextricably linked. And much earlier interventions, the willingness to invest in prevention and to view the opportunity of having avoided a country, you know, descending into armed conflict and open conflict, I think is a litany of missed opportunities. And just if you take the Afghanistan situation, where we are just seeing, in a sense, the security and military response withdrawing after over 20 years, the total cost to the United States of the Afghanistan war, in inverted commas, is estimated at well over $2 trillion. And that is not taking into account other countries who have invested in that. Imagine for a moment that we would have deployed a fraction of that earlier and been able to deal with some of the reasons why conflict has become an extremism and extremist forces so embedded in parts of Afghanistan, and addressed basically a need by a population to not be dependent on these groups. There are many other examples where that applies too, and I think we do need to accept that as an international community, earlier interventions and a willingness to invest in conflict prevention and addressing the underlying causes may very well be a much more cost-effective way than a wait-and-see attitude and then having to step up with extraordinary resources required because the crisis has exploded. But again, there is no simple formula here that you can apply. But I think in all the years that I've worked at that interface between development, crisis, conflict, and early responses and prevention, my overwhelming sense is one of missed opportunities prevailing far more than wisdom and rationale leading us to act together earlier.
I want to thank you for your wisdom, but I'm going to hold you for just a few more minutes because I have a task I'd like to ask you to do. We're going to move on to the first of our two panels. The topic for the first panel is challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis context from the perspective of partner countries. And I'd like to call on the administrator to do the honors and please introduce the panelists for us.
I will gladly do so. So let me just briefly, first of all, again, thank the panelists, thank our colleagues for this wonderful platform that they have created. And I would like to now introduce His Excellency Dr. Francis Mustafa Kaikai, the Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Sierra Leone, and who serves also as the chair of the G7 Plus group of fragile states. And together with him, Professor Mona Harb, Professor of Urban Studies and Politics and Research Lead at the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut. So, Mark, with that, over to you. And again, thank you to both our panelists for being with us today.
And thank you to you, Achim Stein, Administrator of UNDP, for joining us for those that wonderful opening introductory remarks and thoughts. We're going to let you go now, but thank you so much, and we're going to continue another hour of very fruitful conversation. Now, this panel is, as I said, the subject matter of this panel is challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis context from the perspective of partner countries. I want to say a warm welcome to the Honourable Minister and the esteemed Professor. You're both very, very welcome to kick us off now. I'll start by asking you each in turn to speak for 5 minutes on this discussion topic of the challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis context. And I'll begin with Minister Kaikai. You've got quite a unique perspective because before you joined the Sierra Leonean government, you spent over a decade, 12 years as a senior UN staff member in conflict and crisis hit context. So you've got a remarkable viewpoint from many different perspectives. I'd like you to bring that to bear for 5 minutes on this subject. Please, you have the floor, Your Excellency.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sir Moderator. I think, I must thank the UNDP for this. It's indeed a pleasure always to listen to development experts, and especially to also listen to people who participate in this development dialogue series, which the UNDP organizes every year. This time I'm here really on behalf of the G7 Plus group of countries. And I would like to thank the UNDP for organizing a series of discussions during this particular dialogue series. I really hope that the outcome of these discussions will result in a framework that is responsive and effective in achieving stability in the world's fragile countries. The coming years that cover the decade of action on the 2030 SDGs are pivotal in addressing the needs of fragile and conflict-affected countries as we seek to reverse the grim forecast that extreme poverty will be concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected countries by 2035. The COVID-19 pandemic and the urgent need for recovery makes addressing the issues of fragility even more important as we struggle to cope with the impact of the pandemic in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Therefore,
I think we might have lost him.
Behind in achieving the
yes, I think. Oh, he's back.
Goals.
Go ahead, sir. We lost you for a second.
Thank you very much, moderator. There is enough statistical evidence to prove that global prosperity depends on peace and stability in fragile countries. And I think we heard from Achim Steiner, and he tried to emphasize that in many, many ways. Peace and stability might be taken for granted in normal settings in developing and developed nations. For our G7 plus countries, many of which are home to people who were born in wars and grew up in fragility, we do not take peace for granted. Many of our countries have experienced wars or some form of conflict. Each of them has been through repeated cycles of wars and social and economic crises. And sadly, some of them still go through these situations. And there are many examples in Africa, the Middle East, and I listened to the UNDP Administrator Kinley. He mentioned the issue of Yemen. He mentioned the issue of Somalia, 2 countries that are part of the G7 plus countries, and where the development challenges truly are present, and that they are grappling with challenges. And like many countries that have gone through war, and some have now graduated from war for so many years, post-conflict challenges remain, and fragility is still rife. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has just compounded the problem. Now, against this backdrop, and in the interest of the theme of today's closing event of the series on development dialogue, I would like to make maybe 3 points that reflect our perspective. I mean, our desire and our ambition, as a group, that is very much desirous of change, of development, and so on. Firstly, I truly hope that the decade ahead of us is really a decade of action, and not a decade of mere statistics, multiple assessments, and kind words. Some of these may be necessary, but what we need most is action, real action, to pursue peace. We need action to ensure no one is left behind. We need action to strengthen our institutions, and we need actions to achieve the SDGs in conflict-affected, fragile settings. And we need to be decisive in our actions. I mean, this is what the first thing that I will really state going forward in terms of, trying to address this so-called decade of action. Secondly, as the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the vulnerability of our national institutions, with my country, Sierra Leone, being no exception, it is also revealing that international cooperation in fragile settings needs to become effective and more responsive to our context and current realities. We do acknowledge that our partners displayed a lot of flexibility, and they have, really, in repurposing resources to support the COVID-19 response in our countries. We need to see more of this in the recovery efforts, continuing with COVID or post-COVID pandemic. Now we talk about a new wave in most of our countries. And so the crisis is somehow deepening, because just when we think we are overcoming the crisis and trying to enter a recovery phase, we hear of a third wave, a more deadly wave, and so on. So which means we're going to need more and more attention and so on, and working together with the international community. The decade of action cannot be business as usual. We need to be bolder and reform the systems in ways that suits today's context, and in particular sensitive to each setting. We engage in. We don't need to shop for new solutions internationally. Instead, we need to explore local means to address fragility and pursue stability. And for this, we are really grateful to UNDP and the UN family and many other development partners, who are supporting us in our settings. Now, this brings me to my third and last point. This is time to renew our political commitment to the New Deal for engagement in fragile states. The New Deal is a framework that is most relevant to countries in fragile situations. The New Deal principles were inspired by the experiences of our countries and required political leadership in its implementation in order to effectively address fragility and building states that have experienced conflict. While we thank the UNDP for supporting the implementation of the New Deal, I recommend strongly on behalf of the group of G7 Plus group that UNDP aligns the framework for development solutions for crisis and fragile contexts today, tomorrow, and 2030 with the New Deal principles. I will stop with those 3 very critical reflections that I think are really important, for this dialogue series. Thank you very much.
Thank you. They are very, very important. I'm going to come back to you, Minister, with a question in a moment. But now I'd like to turn to Professor Mona Harb of the American University in Beirut. You're most welcome. Now, your research covers a wide range of areas, including governance, urban activism, and how people, I guess, come together in fragmented cities and spaces. You've written several books on such topics. So if you could please speak for just 5 minutes to kick us off from your perspective on challenges and opportunities for developmental solutions in a crisis context. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks for this generous invitation. It's a bit sad actually to be now in a group of fragile and conflict-affected states. Lebanon has completely slid in that direction for the past couple of years, and I would say we're in a free fall and we don't really see a bottom, so things have been quite difficult here. I believe a lot of people are aware of this, and anyway, I don't want to spend the few precious minutes I have to demonstrate this through figures, but I will just say that the situation here is beyond fragility, and people are really scrapping to survive. This is mainly a situation that has been caused by the fact that we are led by political rulers who are not operating as public agents, as public servants, serving a public good. They are much more serving their own interests, capturing and extracting rent from public and natural resources. And this is happening alongside a network of bankers, developers, businessmen, and other contractors. So how did we reach here? What are the drivers of this situation, and what can be done? I will speak, as you introduced me, from a position of an urban researcher who's concerned with matters of urban politics. And I want to highlight 3 challenges that I think we need to identify, understand well, to be able to devise potential responses to these challenges. So the first would be the quasi-absence of effective and accountable public institutions. And here I want to qualify that this is not just a passive, random absence, that it is an absence that has been created, manufactured by these political rulers I mentioned, who systematically eviscerated the role of public institutions and hollowed them out and made them into units that serve their own clienteles and their own networks and their interests. This is a huge structural impediment for development solutions and interventions to international organizations and any party who wants to intervene to help the situation and advance development through aid and assistance, even humanitarian aid. International organizations and partners find themselves in a position where they cannot work with government and public that lack public administrations that are accountable and effective, and where the support could further networks of clientelism and corruption at the expense of people's needs, especially the most vulnerable groups. And I think this is Lebanon is a key example of this predicament, because currently international aid is not being currently fully deployed, despite the compounded crisis and the huge blast that destroyed a third of the city, because of this challenge of international organization not wanting to further corruption and cronyism. So that challenge is closely associated to another one, which is who protects the common good, the public interest, the public as a whole, in a situation where we don't have public institutions that play this role, where we don't have representative, effective, and accountable public institution, where we don't have a rule of law. Who will advance principles of social and environmental justice? This is a key question, as far as I'm concerned, that we're facing every day in Beirut. So if the state is no longer playing this role, who can play it? In the reconstruction of Beirut after the blast, and we've been very committed to this at the Beirut Urban Lab in partnership with UNDP, among others, we're grappling with this question and trying to think how to address it, because we know that reconstruction and recovery, like any development policy, cannot happen solely by cannot be led solely by international organizations and NGOs and NGOs. We know this too well. We have a lot of examples that demonstrate that this doesn't work. We also know that because it's not the job of these institutions to protect the public good. It's the job of public institutions to do that. The Lebanese government has entrusted a branch of the army to coordinate relief works on the ground, and there are more talks currently about empowering the army further in the response if we finally get our act together and form a government that would carry out reforms. But this is again an issue because the military is also not the guarantor of the common good. So what we have been doing is pushing for identifying ingredients of public institutions we could work with, at least partially work with effectively, to try to respond to the situation and rebuild public institutions from within with potential partners. We're building a coalition of advocates for this public good that would happen through the public institutions. You want me to end? I still had a point.
No, can you hold that point? Because I want to go into a Q&A. I see some questions coming in through the chat box that are directed at you, and I want to give us time to get to those. So let me start by just going back to the Honourable Minister. Very interesting to hear you talk about what we need is real action. I think that word real really jumps out. Now, last week, the G7 Plus, I believe you held your second conference on state fragility. Pandemics, vaccination, and solidarity, I think, was the theme that you chose. Now, going forward, my question to you is, what's the role of international cooperation actors, including UNDP, in defeating the impacts of this pandemic in the fragile countries, many of which are members of the G7 Plus? For example, maybe you can tell us some of the ways that international partners can do more to help in recovery efforts, in such things like relief packages or overburdened healthcare systems, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And, somehow the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been very peculiar in our settings in many respects. The effect has been adverse and disproportionate for fragile countries, and we are already fragile on so many fronts. So the impact, some pandemic like COVID-19 can last much longer than would in normal settings. It has already reversed the gains we have made over the past years and even decades. So to answer your question on the role of international cooperation, I would like to remind us all about first of all, the debt burden that we carry, and it's not going away. I mean, it's being relaxed a little bit, but this is something that we need to keep an eye on as we talk about international cooperation, because many of our countries are still facing a debt burden in addition to, the COVID-19. So easing that burden is one area that will be instrumental in the recovery process. Also, there is the issue of access and availability of vaccines, access to vaccines and the availability to our countries to ensure that the population is immunized. I mean, this is an investment in shared prosperity as we see it. We have issued joint statements on this, and circulated it widely to reflect our collective priorities and curbing the pandemic in its social and economic impact. On the health systems, clearly the health systems are under stress currently, just like the economies themselves. And how do we make sure the health systems can cope with this if it keeps going on and on and on and on? And as we know, for now, the health systems in the urban areas, they are much more catered for than the health systems in the rural settings in most of our countries. So we see, some deterioration in the response. In those situations. So the health systems really are under challenge, and even it's going to affect even the logistics around the distribution of vaccines and so on. So there are lots of challenges there, and I see, the overseas development assistance generally to our countries, needs to take this into consideration, because the health crisis, the economic distress, they are really so impactful, and we need to address them so that things don't deteriorate further. Because if we don't focus on the health sector and make sure it's robust enough to withstand what is going on, it's a problem. Because now, I was just listening to our health minister the other day in my own country. They are worried that the focus on fighting COVID-19 pandemic is also affecting response to other diseases. You know, here we have malaria and other diseases which are normally inflicting the population and for which the health systems have been set up. But then once we start actually redeploying resources from those sectors, from those other fights, from those other essential vaccinations for children to the COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes a real challenge for us. There's also the crisis of producing oxygen, for example, in the hospitals. So where you have more and more patients coming to hospitals, it's going to overwhelm the system. And the system is already overwhelmed as I speak. And I can speak for many of our G7 plus countries that really, you know, how do we cope if the numbers keep rising? And as in some of the countries like ours, we thought we were actually turning the corner from COVID-19. We hear of a new strain of the disease and so on. So these are real challenges and real things that we have to discuss. And so when it comes to international cooperation, Sierra Leone has done very well. I think we are doing very well with our development partners, including the United Nations Development Program and the UN system in general. We have what we call a Development Partnership Committee meetings, and we have a special committee that sits down to discuss these things at the highest level, at the presidential level, and you know, so that priorities can be clearly defined by each country, and then partners can respond accordingly. And this is something we recommend strongly for other G7 plus countries, because we believe this is the way forward. This is going to be the way we are going to probably address this crisis going forward. We don't know how long it's going to take, but clearly we need support. And I'm happy Mona raised the issue of institutions, public institutions. Public institutions and their vitality is very important also in this fight, because where you are bereft of a strong support in these countries, I tell you, it's very difficult. We cannot leave it to non-governmental actors. We cannot leave it to civil society to provide leadership at all levels. And I think that's really very important going forward. And international cooperation should realize this. So there is a lot more we can do ourselves to make sure we can make use of international support. We have to organize ourselves as well as countries, and we have to make sure our institutions are supported, they are strong, and so on, so that international cooperation can really make sense. You know, so both internally, externally, I mean, there are things to come together to assist with the current situation and to address the development challenge that's
I was also taken with when the professor said quasi absence of public institutions. When we think of how we are going to strengthen governments, the default a lot of the time is to think about the national government, the federal government, but local and municipal governments are closest to the people most of the time, and they can have the greatest and most immediate impact on the lives of citizens. So, Professor, from your perspective, what more can we do now, given this peculiar and protracted situation that we find ourselves in with COVID-19 and exacerbating already endemic deep problems? What can we do as partners to strengthen governments and leadership and capacity on a local level as a solution to crisis? What are some of the main issues, for example, affecting cities during crisis that we can come together to change?
Yes, that's an important question. Thank you for raising it. It's an important question also when we think about the fact that many of these local governments are not elected in many places that are in fragile contexts. So they're not really representative or democratic, or they're elected by a portion of the population, not by all residents living in these places. So that also raises the issue of these partnerships. What can be done, because we need to try to identify some avenues for change, is to identify the actors inside public institutions, local governments, but also outside local governments that are organizing and working to advance the notion of the common good, of togetherness, of shared spaces and shared lives together, and they're organized towards that. And this is where I feel that there's the most possibilities and opportunities happening. It's through the organizing of these groups, of collectives, civil society organizations, political groups, unions, alternative professional unions to the mainstream ones, cooperatives, even research labs and think tanks that are working together and organizing to advance these values of social and environmental justice, frameworks and modalities of work that are experimental and that can further these solidarities and mutual aid in these contexts. I think that we need to identify these groups and partner with them, build their capacities, and make sure to link them to public institutions that are still operational, even partially, to strengthen and build capacity of these public institutions that can then further and amplify the work of the collective good more broadly. That would be my recommendation, to build together an ecosystem of change that can advance the principle of social and environmental justice in these contexts that's much needed. We need to do that also through a variety of ingredients that are very important to reshape the political economy itself, because we cannot always operate as if there's no power map of stakeholders that are trying to undermine the works of these groups. We need to acknowledge the fact that there's a power map of interest, and to try to find cracks in that system and operate within it. This is a very important dimension of the work in fragile context, because often development work depoliticizes the action and looks at the landscape as if it lacks political economy actors, which in reality are the forces that undermine durable change and the struggle for social and environmental justice. So we need to be aware of this, and we need to advance robust understandings of the political and the urban, of spatiality, think at multiple scales, have a holistic and interdisciplinary approach to the response, engage people in our action through people-centered methodologies, participatory planning methodologies, reintroduce urban planning as tools of interventions, area-based methodologies, and also generate data sets that are georeferenced, gender sensitive, and which can inform the action in environmentally and gender sensitive ways.
I wish we had more time with you, Mona Harb of the American University in Beirut, and His Excellency Dr. Francis Mustafa Kai, Minister in Sierra Leone. Thank you so much for kicking us off there. I wish we could do another half an hour, but we have to move on to the next panel. But thank you very much. The struggle continues. Now, before we dive into our second and final panel, I'd like to show you the shortest of short films about these UNDP development dialogues. Now, UNDP wants to use this platform to rethink and rethink our approach to combating crisis and fragility, and re-emphasize a people-centered approach to development with bold new approaches for the decade of action. We want to strengthen the international community's global commitment to leave no one behind. After all, global development is in everyone's interest. Please roll the film. There you have it. Our second panel looks at the challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis and fragile context from the perspective of development partners. And for this, we're joined by four excellent speakers. Frank Bousquet is the Deputy Director, International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Dani Sriskanda Raja is the Executive Officer, Oxfam Great Britain. That's, of course, the global movement of people working together to end the injustice of poverty. Patricia Danzi is Director General, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. The SDC is charged with implementing Switzerland's mission to help alleviate poverty and promote the respect for human rights and stronger democracy around the world. Finally, Susanna Moorhead. She's the Chair, OECD Development Assistance Committee, or DAC. It's a unique international forum for many of the largest providers of aid. You're all very welcome to this, the final panel of the final session of the Development Dialogues. Now, again, I'll go to each of you for a brief 4-minute remarks on the topic that we're talking about, and then we can sort of open it up to some questions. I'm looking to the right of my screen, and I see quite a few questions teed up for you guys. So first, I welcome back Frank Bousquet, because he was on my last Development Dialogue session on financing. Frank, you spent 16 years at the World Bank, and then this year, as I recall, you moved to IMF, where you're now the Deputy Director for the Institute for Capacity Development, where you're leading the IMF's efforts to strengthen engagement with fragile and affected states. I should mention that one of your main tasks over there is the implementation of the IMF's $25 billion IDA financing package for poorer countries. Frank, give us 4 minutes on the topic. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. So the IDA, the 25 billion, was part of the World Bank. But listen, super happy, Mark, to be here with you and all distinguished panelists. So very in 4 minutes, the key challenge, we have heard them. I think the fact that even before COVID-19, unfortunately, the drivers of fragility, whether it's about governance, weak capacity, exclusion, violence, climate change, demographic trends, are actually going in the wrong directions. COVID-19, we heard about it as well, just coming from an IMF perspective. Let's make it clear that this has hit significantly the FCS in terms of the GDP growth, in terms of debt, in terms of inflation. The pandemic has hit the countries that are impacted by fragility and conflict much more than advanced economy or other emerging and developing economies. Our estimate is that the real output contracted by an estimated 5.6% last year. And that, as I mentioned, inflationary pressure are also rising. So compared to the pre-pandemic projections, you only look at public debt in those countries that are impacted by fragility and conflict, it has actually rose by almost 16 percentage points to reach about 76% of GDP in 2020. So clearly, this pandemic has exacerbated the situation of those countries already impacted by fragility and conflict, which are now at a real risk of falling even further behind the rest of the world. And that's why we are talking about the risk of divergence. Now, action opportunities, I think it's important to look about what has been done. There has been significant scale-up of support from the international community since the beginning of COVID-19. Also, there has been important G20 initiative to support the debt relief of those low-income and fragile countries. The G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the SSI, was actually essential, enabling 45 of the poorest countries to defer official debt service, which has really freed up some resources to mitigate the social, the economic, and health impact of the pandemic. The initiative delivered about $6 billion in debt relief last year, and it has been extended until the end of this year. What are some of the key points that I think, and some of them have been really mentioned by Minister Kaikai, but also by Hakim Steimer. I think, well, to deal with the debt sustainability issue, more grants, more concessional financing from the international community for those countries is critical. Second point, we heard about strengthening the resilience, very important, the preparedness. COVID will not be the last crisis. Focusing on health system, I like, again, Minister Kaikai mentioning, be careful. It's not only about COVID. It's about all the lack of resources that are today happening in many other diseases that those countries are dealing with. And it's also looking at focusing more on the prevention. I'm quite pleased to see all the efforts from the UN, from the World Bank, and many other actors to look more and more at the emerging risk before a country falls into fragility and conflict. What can be done in terms of dealing with some grievances, such as inequality, exclusion, governance, that if they are not being dealt with, would become an issue of a crisis. So it's not only building system preparedness for the next crisis, social safety net, health system that are critical, but also what are actually some of the trends and can be more proactive. And there's been a lot of effort under IDA with the World Bank, but also with the UN, PBSO group of Oscar, a lot of support in these aspects. Now, last point, and I will stop here, Mark. No single organization can do it alone. We say it, it's the partnership word, which is critical in these aspects more than ever. So happy to see organizations, humanitarian actors, Oxfam and others, because they have a key role to play. They have strength that other bigger actors don't have. They have the proximity to the vulnerable groups. They have the understanding, the intel, sometimes in insecure area where no other actors is present. And they're really here on the ground to have also a very good understanding of the political economy. And I think it's important to recognize it's not a top-down approach. Bottom-up, super important. Second point, development actors, MDBs, have a key role to play. Again, working more with government to influence the critical policy reforms to address the root cause of fragility and conflict, to use financing to create the incentive again on this strengthening of institutions preventions. Security actors have also a role to play. We were hearing about the G5 Sahel. Without security, it's difficult to focus on development of peace. And financial institutions coming to the IMF have a key role to play. I mean, peace, stability, and macroeconomics are very much intertwined. We know that macroeconomic policy, social reforms can create the conditions in which social cohesion can improve. So I will stop here. There are clearly some opportunities. There's been an amazing scaling up of support, but much more needs to be done. I will stop here.
Thank you, Frank Bousquet, IMF there. I'm going to come back to you with a few questions. I can see one that's just for you right on the in the comment section there. But I'll now move on to Danny Sriskandarajah, who is the Chief Executive Officer, Oxfam Great Britain. It's great to have you on a panel. I've seen you speak a number of times, and I've done hundreds of panels, and this is the first time that I've managed to get you on one of my panels, so it's great to see you. It's also interesting, Danny, to have the IMF and Oxfam on the same panel. I love the development dialogues because it's not just a chorus. They're very differing views over the past 4 months. Panelists have been quite diverse because I was reading Oxfam's views on the G7 summit, and they couldn't be any different from IMF's. The IMF managing director, Kristina Georgieva, called it a consequential summit where the renewed spirit of international cooperation was palpable. But Oxfam called it a colossal failure and said the G7 had chosen to cook the books on vaccines and continue to cook the planet, which was quite powerful words. I don't want you to you don't have to necessarily comment on that, but I just thought it's interesting to go from IMF to Oxfam. Now, the objective of this panel is to look at the challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis and the fragile context from the perspective of development partners like you. So can you take 5 minutes to give us your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Mark. Well, look, there is a link, I think, between what we were saying about the G7 summit and today's topic. And it's what Achim Steiner was saying in his opening remarks about the opportunity that we have. There's no doubt that the COVID pandemic has seen a sort of great reversal on so much of the progress that we've made in human development in recent decades. And yet there's also an opportunity. And why we thought that the G7 summit was such a colossal failure is because never has that gap between what the world expects of the world's richest nations, whether it's on vaccine access or debt finance or on climate action, has that gap between expectation and what they've actually delivered been so huge. And, I'm an optimist, and I do think that we've seen, glimpses of countries, of governments, of intergovernmental agencies sort of ripping up the rule book as a result of the COVID pandemic and coming up with really interesting solutions. Take vaccine access that the minister was talking about earlier. It's wonderful to see 100-odd countries, including the United States and France, getting behind an idea of a temporary waiver of intellectual property rights on COVID vaccines. We would argue that more countries should support that, and quickly, but who would have thought just a few years ago that the US government would rally behind such a move? And I think that's that potential that we have to make the most of. And for those of us who are interested in, development solutions, particularly in fragile context, I would urge us to also be bold. Let's dream big and make the most of this moment. At Oxfam, we've done as it happened, we were doing a big strategic review of our future just as the pandemic hit. And one of the conclusions we've reached is that development actors do have to pay particular attention to fragile contexts. And we're going to double down, if you will, in some of those places around the world. And we've talked a bit about the DRC, Yemen, Syria. And the idea is we want to change our approach. We want to build on our work on rights, resilience, and response. I mean, that's our language for what's often called the triple nexus or an integrated approach, because the sort of huge frustration is we've built an international architecture that's been relatively good at response after the fact. Humanitarian emergency happens, people scramble around to raise some resources, they come up with some funding, and they often end up with short-term solutions that don't really engage local partners very well. And we've cobbled together and we've limped on and made it work. Whereas I think this is an opportunity for us to do a great reset about, say, how the financing of the global response to humanitarian action might happen. Another, I think, moment of huge opportunity, and again, Achim Steiner talked about it, is around how do we use the digital transformation to change the way that we work. A good example for us at Oxfam is how do you bring citizen voice to bear in the decisions and the lives of all of our organizations. And, it's never been easier to include people actively and meaningfully in our decisions about where we program, what we do, what services we offer, to test how well we're providing, to be accountable to those people that we claim to be serving. And I think, we need a participation revolution. We need to build from the bottom up so that it's no longer about these sort of institutions up here, providing a sort of paternalistic intervention. We need to be part of that infrastructure and build a more equitable and accountable infrastructure. And so, whether you look at how we finance our response in fragile context or how we include citizen voice, or a range of other things, I think the opportunities here for us to do a sort of transformative approach post-COVID to not just build back better, but build back differently. I think that's the prize here, and that's what we're disappointed about G7 leaders. But I know that this group of people, including Frank and Achim, are up for it. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Really, really interesting. So you're rethinking boldly, with a brutal simplicity of thought, exactly how to move forward, participation, partnership, not this kind of dropping solutions from the sky. So I'm going to turn to Patricia Danzi, Director General of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Patricia, it's really interesting coming off the bat, because I want to know in 5 minutes, really, your thoughts on how your perspective is in all this, and particularly on this subject of challenges and opportunities for development solutions in crisis and fragile context. Go ahead, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for the participants also in this panel. Very interesting things that we have heard already. I will put the angle from a country level, from a Swiss development cooperation level. So how can we change attitudes? How can we make people work together differently? While we heard it, conflicts last longer. We have the environment, we have the pandemic, people are displaced for a very long time. How can we look at this famous triple nexus differently? And I believe very strongly that we have to put the people in the center. When you think about being displaced for conflict, you have immediate needs, but very, very, very quickly, you have to maybe change your way of life. You have to look at where you will live, where your children will go to school, and what your perspectives will be in the future. So we will have to push all the actors around the table and look at the problem and put the people in the center. I think the pandemic has learned us do so, and the results are actually quite spectacular, that it is possible to do, and we shouldn't lose what we have learned through this crisis and actually apply it in the future to address all the different global challenges so well outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals, and also keep changing the attitude of how we work together. I've come back from 3 trips now to the Ukraine, Sudan and Afghanistan. And what was interesting actually was when we had discussions with the government, they all said the same thing. We have immediate needs that we have to tackle, humanitarian needs for that matter, but at the same time, we have development plans and we have to maybe freeze them and put them on the back burner for a while. But we need partners that stand behind us on all the aspects, that can intervene quickly, but also help us not to lose focus and support us in the long term on what we want to achieve for our countries. And I think that is a very important message. Another message that I've heard, which touched me quite a lot, and we should all actually take that into consideration all the time. We speak to people that speak our language. It might be English or it is translated by people with an academic background very often, but there are many, and Achim Steiner mentioned it, many that live in areas off the grid and in areas that are not accessible, that have no education to fill in the right form to achieve and to get a grant or access for even a local NGO to develop their own communities. And we have to take this into consideration and have a look at the ones that don't speak, either geographically, but also in the different areas of development that we want to address. And that actually puts me to the proximity aspect of our work. We very much, as the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, look at our impact in terms of proximity. How can we be close to where the problems are? How can we be, by decentralizing the aspects of the problem to local communities, have the most impact? For this, we need flexibility. We need flexibility in budgetary lines. We need flexibility in terms of intervention modes. And what we also need as a country, we need to have our home base in a good mood to keep the predictability of our funding alive. That means we have constantly the challenge to translate very complex issues into a language that also our parliamentarians understand, so that we can keep the money up for the very important tasks that we all have to accomplish. We have several projects and programs with UNDP that actually underline this. In Myanmar, when we have to change and keep this flexibility and now work with local actors more than with government one. In Gaza, when we talk about jobs and development, the entrepreneurship that we push ahead with UNDP, or with the World Bank in Mali, where we work on this decentralization and the proximity to address problems and challenges on a more local level. I'll leave it there and leave the floor for questions and the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Danzi of the Swiss Development Corporation. Final speaker, last but not least, is Susanna Moorhead, who's chair of OECD's Development Assistance Committee, which is the unique international forum for some of the largest provider of aid. I'm going to give you your 5 minutes, but in interest of time, I want to actually kind of like see if you could also weave in the answer to this question. There's so many questions here. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but there is one here. It says, as both developed and developing countries focus inward to deal with the socio-economic impacts of COVID, how can UNDP, and I believe it should say, how can UNDP and its partners promote more global solidarity and global cooperation? Funny, I just came off actually a vaccine, a panel that I moderated on vaccine equity, which this was obviously the central theme, global cooperation and global solidarity. So perhaps maybe from your position, you could sort of touch on that a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Mark. It's actually, I'm glad you asked me a question, because it's really difficult coming in after so many esteemed friends and colleagues and being able to say anything new. So look, I think the short answer is UNDP can't and shouldn't do it on its own. One of the things that UNDP and the rest of the UN system certainly needs to do is to work better together. I mean, that's what the humanitarian development peace nexus is all about. It's about collaborating across agencies and across multilaterals. So I think the answer is, we need a new multilateralism. And that is most likely, I think, to be driven by a far greater understanding than we've ever had about what a global public bad is, such as COVID, and what a global public good could be, which would be universal access to vaccines. So there's I think we talked a lot before the pandemic about, it was rather overstated, but the end of multilateralism, the decline of the effectiveness of many of these institutions that we've all invested so much in. But I think, to sort of grasp Danny's opportunity, it is about all of us pulling together to think about a new multilateralism and how, as I say, the different parts of the global architecture collaborate rather than compete for scarce resources. So that would be my first point. My second is to go back to something that Mona said and to pick up on Patricia's point, which is, at the end of the day, most of what we're talking about is about political economy. And Mona quite rightly said that there were technical development solutions were not going to work. We know that. We've done enough analytical work, enough operational work. We've made enough mistakes. We've learned from them to know that at the end of the day, this comes down to politics and governance. And I thought Mona's point about countries that are suffering from fragility and conflict, that they need to tackle the failures of governance and stop hollowing out institutions. And as DAC members and donors, we need to roll our sleeves up and think about how we can help that process and how we can be part of the solution of the political economy failure, which let's face it, underlies fragility and conflict. And the flip side of that is that if we're going to carry on convincing donor country taxpayers that this really matters, as you're right, as we turn in on each other, on ourselves, as we, worry about high levels of unemployment, of enormous debt, one thing and another, we've got to be able to demonstrate that there is a political willingness to prevent conflict and to tackle fragility. And if we don't, I have a real fear that I think it's almost a silent crisis of escalating violence will be overshadowed by the COVID pandemic. And that silent crisis, it's happening domestically against women and girls. It's happening within countries, as we're seeing, for example, in Ethiopia and Tigray. It's happening between countries. And, poor countries, the violence is on the rise. And unless we find a way of collaborating multilaterally, then the SDGs are not just going to be in reverse as they are now, but they're going to feel more and more and more out of reach. So that would be my answer. New multilateralism, political economy, and I think we have to stand up and say collectively that in the 21st century, we are going to invest far more in prevention, in peace building, and in making sure that this silent crisis doesn't take hold. If I think about conversations that I've had recently with DAC members, there is a real concern about this silent crisis, but also a very clear recognition that people are preoccupied with their domestic issues. So it's up to us, I believe, in the multilateral system to make a stronger political case. And to do that, there are some pretty simple things. Sometimes this feels impossible, but I think you often have to just stop and think, well, what does work? There's some really interesting innovations being tried out, for example, in Somalia, surely one of the most difficult operating environments in the world, on country platforms, which is how do you get government and other stakeholders and donors to sit around the same table and hammer out what to do. The UN resident coordinator, empowered resident coordinator model. I mean, look, I know it's been tough for UNDP, but the UN needs to get together, put its very, very, very best people into these very difficult contexts, and to really pool resources to provide that convening mechanism for all donors, not just DAC members, others too. And last but not least, there's overwhelming evidence to show that if you put women at the heart of peacekeeping and peacebuilding, it works better. So we've got to do much better at that. And needless to say, stamp out this scourge of development workers, humanitarian workers, perpetrating sexual exploitation and abuse when they are pretending to help people. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Susanna, OECD Development Assistant Committee. I want to move on to Frank, actually, because Frank, I had a question for you. I understand that IMF is also working on its own framework. It's working on its own fragility strategy, so to speak. I don't know how far along you've got with that. But the UNDP is now set up. We heard from Achim Steiner this ambitious plan to accompany countries out of fragility and looking at 2030 and beyond. And those stable societies are necessary. They're a prerequisite for the work that institutions like the IMF does. So with you working on your own fragility strategy, can you tell us the role of IMF in this and where the space is for closer cooperation with the UNDP and with the UN at large, I suppose?
So, Mark, thank you. This is quite timely. The fund has a huge comparative advantage in terms of supporting countries impacted by fragility and conflict. I remember I mentioned the very close link between macroeconomic stability and peace. The fund is really looking at three key areas. First, promoting macroeconomic stability. Sustainable economic growth is a key component to prevent the emergence of high conflict risk, but also to help countries transitioning out of fragility. Let's make it clear. Second point, it's about building capacity of institutions. This is essentials. So for the fund perspective, it's really about strengthening public financial management, revenue mobilization, which is typically quite low in those countries, which is so important. Focusing on central banking, payment system operation, anti-corruption, and also preventing all the illicit financial flows. All those core areas, which are the fund expertise, are actually quite essential in terms of preventing or helping countries exiting from fragility. And of course, there is a whole provisions of financial assistance in a catalytic manner, being able then to leverage bilateral and ODA support. I just would like to mention that, in response to the COVID-19 crisis, there's been significant support being provided by the fund as well. So the work that we are looking is really to take stock of this experience. The fund has a long standing engagement in those countries, and to scale up this engagement, because we recognize, especially with COVID-19, as I mentioned before, that those countries are really at risk of falling way behind all the other ones. Let me stop here.
Thanks, Frank. I want to turn to Danny now. We heard from the administrator of UNDP's approach. So let me be a little provocative here. Do you think it's the right direction? What are your thoughts on that? And what more would you like to see from UNDP so that they leave no one behind, as they say?
Well, I think it's a great moment, and it's great to see the leadership that Achim is setting for UNDP and the ambition. And as I said, I think it fits with the moment in human history that we are. But in some ways, I think we need to make sure that we're asking, we're going back to first principles. Almost every one of us on this call works for an organization and is paid for an organization that sits within the sort of broader aid system, which was built on this presumption that there were some rich countries over here and some poor countries over there, and that we needed mechanisms to transfer, donations or tax into sort of the needy people, the beneficiaries over here. that was necessary and it was important, and I'm proud of the role that organizations like Oxfam have played in that. But in the rest of the 21st century, we need a fundamentally different architecture, or one that's based on different principles, where you still want resources, money to move, but move much more efficiently and much more empoweringly, so that it isn't there isn't a ton of intermediaries competing falling over each other to sort of take a piece of the action. And importantly, and I see there's a question about localization in there, that doesn't treat those ultimate sort of, the people who are involved in this as simply as beneficiaries of some sort of largesse or donation of charity, but instead build a system of mutuality. And I think that's where we need strong multilateral institutions, particularly in the UN, because at the end of the day, this is the best starting point we have as civilization. We built this amazing international architecture that is as democratic as it can be. And from here, I think we need to sort of nurture the next generation of development institutions that can address the sort of questions around fragility that Akim and his colleagues want to address. And I wish them well, but I suppose I keep coming back to this, aim high, because we can't waste this opportunity.
Thank you. Ambassador Danzi, you at the Swiss Development Corporation, I believe you just released a note on your new political economy approach. And this is quite interesting because as we've just heard today, that in fragile and crisis context, the real answers will be about behavioral change, real action and behavioral change. So is this new approach, thinking and working politically, as you put it, the way forward for the development community in this difficult crisis context?
I think you have always to stay open to new partnerships. And if the partnership comes from the economic piece of solutions, then we have to embrace it. We have to make sure that we don't lose our compass, that we always work for the reduction of poverty. And once this is set clear, I think the combination of different interventions is a very interesting one. And we should not exclude any, but we have to set our own ambitions and also priorities clear, and then talk together and find also common language there.
Well, I think we've more or less run out of time. I wish I've got so many other questions, many more questions coming in, but we simply do not have the time to answer them. But that has been very, very illuminating. I want to thank all the panelists there for rounding up. That is the last panel of the last session of the Development Dialogues. And so I want to thank you. And I know many of you have joined us over the last 4 months. Many of the panelists that spoke today have done a lot of work in making the Development Dialogues a success. So I want to thank you for your continuing support for this platform, and we look forward to closer cooperation with you going forward. Now, we come to the closing remarks. Before we close this event, I'd like to invite for the closing statement Ms. Asako Okai. She is the UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Director for the Crisis Bureau, where she leads UNDP's corporate crisis-related work and drives UNDP's vision and priorities for crisis prevention, response, and recovery. Please, Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, it is with mixed feeling that I have to close this Development Dialogue series. It's been rich and so insightful, and we learned a lot, and there's much more we need to do. As a matter of fact, over the last 4 months, we have held 38 events, bringing together over 200 speakers from 50 countries. And the event have been attracted close to 4,000 unique participants and over 22,000 views. Let me therefore first thank all the speakers and participants who have joined our dialogue over the last 4 months. Really, if the event in the Development Dialogue series was successful, we owe it to the contribution and the rich discussion that you have all animated. And then let me also congratulate at this juncture Mark and then other moderators, Femi, Fiona, Henley, and many others who supported these events for steering our discussions in the right direction. You have asked right and tough questions and helped us identify the best development solution for today's crisis and to explore the most innovative ideas for confronting the challenges of tomorrow. However, I am also aware that the success of development dialogues was due to the magnitude of the problems that confront the people living in crisis and fragile context. We did not shy away from any of the difficult topics. We talked about political economy, power dynamics, needs for the new multilateralism, new architecture to govern the new ways of flows of money and so forth. And then the list is unfortunately still too long. These dialogue with the key global, regional, and country development partners, this will have to continue with the community that had contributed to this network. We feel that we need really the clear way forward as to what are the bold new approaches that are needed, and then do away with the business as usual. It's not just enough to fulfill our commitment. UNDP feels strengthened in its mission to address these root causes of crisis, work on prevention, and then use the 2030 agenda as a compass as we move forward. And then hopefully with our new strategic plan and our new forthcoming framework for development solution for crisis and fragile context, and most importantly, its practical application to UNDP's work in these settings, we would like to present a tangible step in this direction together with all of you in partnership. This is all signaling our ambition to bring about transformative change in the protracted crisis of today and to prevent and mitigate the impact of the crisis of tomorrow. Really, raise the ambition level. Danny had put it, really, we need to step up, as everybody emphasized. This level of intellectual engagement and this commitment we should continue to maintain. It should not be lost, dispersed. We will build upon this precious network of the human capital, so to speak, invite all participants to join a new space in our Spark Blue platform. This is a digital platform for the conversations and then the input. We would put all the materials from dialogues, and then we would maintain the momentum to exchange views between us on the range of topics related to crisis and fragility. And going forward, UNDP will prioritize partnership with you all and to ensure that together we can effectively analyze, learn, innovate, advocate, and deliver collective results to help build stable societies and support resilience and recovery through choice and opportunity. That's we emphasize in our next strategic plan. We hope that you would accompany us on this journey and count on your support to help us shift gear. And let's us collectively push toward the implementation of the SDGs in crisis and fragile context. Thank you all for your participation and engagement with us over the last few months, and I formally declare the first series of the Development Dialogues Rethinking Solution to Crisis in the Decade of Action closed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Asako Okai, for succinctly bringing to an end the development dialogues. Now, the development dialogue series may be ending, but as you heard from Asako, our collective dialogue on development will continue and intensify. And there are now new opportunities and there'll be new platforms for us to do that. I look forward to seeing many of these ideas and commitments we've heard over the last 4 months manifested into reality over the coming months and years. And I want to thank all the great speakers today and over the past few months. I'll be ending by echoing Asako's message in saying that there is much that we have to do together to bring about transformative change for today and tomorrow. I'm Mark Edo, and it's been a great pleasure to moderate these dialogue sessions. Goodbye, and I hope to see you again soon.